I never made it home from base for Thanksgiving. After emergency surgery, the doctor stood at the foot of my bed and played an audio recording of my husband. He told the hospital staff not to bother calling back unless I was dead. 2 days later, a billing clerk handed me a heavy velvet box and a receipt with a zero balance. A stranger paid for everything she told me, and he asked me to tell you that this changes everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to someone who underestimated your worth and treated you like a burden. My name is Jillian. I am 33 years old and an active duty logistics officer for the United States Army. For the past 6 years, my life has been a carefully orchestrated balancing act. I managed supply chains, troop transports, and equipment deployments across multiple time zones. But no amount of military strategy could have prepared me for the complete collapse of my marriage or the chilling reality of who I had actually married. The nightmare began 2 days before Thanksgiving. The holiday season on base in Virginia is always a frantic sprint. I was stationed at a desk piled high with transport manifests trying to finalize the holiday leave schedules for my unit. My husband Garrett was supposed to pick me up at 1700 hours. We had a dinner reservation to celebrate his latest corporate achievement. He was a high-powered executive at a major defense contracting firm, a job that afforded him a lavish country club lifestyle. I had been ignoring a dull, persistent ache in my lower abdomen since the previous evening. I chalked it up to stress, too much coffee, and not enough sleep. But by 1400 hours, the dull ache sharpened into a blinding, agonizing pain that doubled me over my desk. A junior officer found me completely pale and covered in a cold sweat. He immediately called for medical transport, but because the base hospital was dealing with a massive power failure at that exact moment, they had to route me to an off-base civilian facility. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and excruciating pain. I was slipping in and out of consciousness, desperately clutching my phone. He never replied. The last thing I remember before the darkness took over completely was the blinding glare of the emergency room ceiling lights and a nurse yelling that my appendix had ruptured. When I finally woke up, the first thing I registered was the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. The air smelled of sharp antiseptic. I slowly opened my eyes, fighting against the heavy fog of anesthesia. The hospital room was dimly lit, quiet, and profoundly lonely. There were no flowers, no cards, and no husband sitting in the visitor chair beside my bed. My abdomen throbbed with a deep hollow ache bound tightly in thick surgical dressings. A few minutes later, the door creaked open. A tall man in a white coat with kind, tired eyes stepped into the room. He introduced himself as Dr. Gallagher, the lead surgeon who had operated on me. He checked my vitals quietly. He explained that my appendix had ruptured before they could get me into the operating room, turning a routine procedure into a complicated emergency surgery. He told me I was lucky the junior officer had found me when he did, because the infection had been spreading rapidly. I thanked him, my voice barely more than a dry whisper. Then I asked the question that had been burning in my mind since I opened my eyes. I asked where Garrett was. I asked if my husband was in the waiting room or getting coffee or perhaps on his way from the office. Dr. Gallagher stopped writing on my chart. He looked at me with a profound sadness that immediately made my chest tighten. He pulled a small tablet from the pocket of his coat and took a deep breath before speaking. He told me that hospital protocol requires them to contact the designated emergency proxy when a patient arrives unresponsive and requires immediate life-saving surgery. They had called Garrett 3 times. The first 2 calls went straight to voicemail. On the third attempt, a hospital administrator finally got through to him on his personal cell phone. Dr. Gallagher explained that they record all emergency dispatch communications for legal and medical liability reasons. He looked down at his tablet, his jaw set in a tight, uncomfortable line. He told me that he felt it was his ethical duty to let me hear the response they received because it had deeply disturbed the entire surgical team. He tapped the screen. The hospital room filled with the unmistakable, irritated tone of my husband. There was background noise on the recording, the clinking of expensive crystal glasses, and the low murmur of a high-end restaurant. The hospital administrator identified herself and urgently explained that Jillian was in critical condition and required emergency surgery for a ruptured appendix. Garrett did not gasp. He did not ask if I was going to be okay. Instead, he let out an exaggerated sigh of annoyance. His exact words echoed through the sterile hospital room. "I am in the middle of a major client dinner. It is just a stomachache. Do not bother calling back unless she is dead." The sharp click of the phone line disconnecting. Dr. Gallagher turned off the tablet and slipped it back into his pocket. He just stood there, allowing the deafening silence of the room to wrap around me. He told me he would send a nurse in to check my pain levels shortly, and quietly excused himself from the room to give me privacy. I lay perfectly still, staring at the blank white ceiling. The physical pain of the surgery was absolutely nothing compared to the crushing, suffocating weight of what I had just heard. I had spent 6 years trying to be the perfect wife, but the recording stripped away every excuse I had ever made for him. My husband, the man I had pledged my life to, had been irritated by my medical emergency. He had actively wished for my death simply because my ruptured appendix was interrupting a business dinner. A hot, searing anger began to replace the cold shock in my veins. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a moment of panic. This was pure, unadulterated, calculated cruelty. I looked down at the medical tape securing the intravenous line to the back of my hand. I reached over and firmly gripped the edge of the medical tape. With one swift, deliberate motion, I completely ripped the tape away from my skin. The sharp sting grounded me instantly, pulling me back to reality. I was an active duty officer. I survived grueling training, intense overseas deployments, and now a ruptured appendix. I was not going to just lie in a hospital bed and cry over a man who valued a client dinner more than my life. I was going to survive this, and I was going to make absolutely sure he realized the massive, unforgivable mistake he had just made. I was not going to be a victim. I was going to be a weapon. He had absolutely no idea what was coming. The decision settled inside me with absolute clarity. Whatever happened next, Garrett would never again mistake my patience for weakness. I shifted my weight against the stiff hospital mattress, fighting a sudden wave of nausea. Every microscopic movement sent a fresh, burning wave of agony radiating across my lower abdomen. The surgical glue tugged at my skin, a sharp reminder of how close I had come to not waking up at all. I reached across the stark white sheets, my hand trembling slightly as I grasped my phone from the small plastic tray table next to the bed. The screen illuminated the dark room, casting a cold, artificial glow across my face. I had 72 unread notifications. I unlocked the screen, bracing myself for a barrage of panicked texts or desperate voicemails. I scrolled through the long list of alerts. There was a message from my commanding officer checking on my status. There were a few routine updates from the transport logistics team. There was an automated weather alert warning of early winter frost. There was absolutely nothing from Garrett. Not a single text asking if I was alive. Not a single missed call. The man who had vowed to stand by me in sickness and in health had not even bothered to send a generic check-in message after telling the hospital to leave him alone. But his name was definitely on my screen. It was plastered across dozens of automated alerts from our joint bank account. I tapped on the banking application, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The screen loaded, displaying the grim reality of my 6-year marriage in stark black and white numbers. Garrett was a senior executive at Montgomery Defense Solutions, a position that came with a massive salary, lucrative stock options, and an ego to match. He wore bespoke Italian suits and drove a luxury sports car that cost more than a starter home. Yet somehow it was always my military officer salary that kept our actual lives afloat. He treated my career in the United States Army like a quaint, mildly embarrassing hobby. He would stand around at his elite country club mixers swirling an expensive bourbon and tell his wealthy colleagues that his wife was busy playing soldier. He loved the patriotic optics of having a wife in uniform to show off at corporate galas. But behind closed doors, he constantly belittled my work as rigid, low-paying, and thoroughly unglamorous. I scrolled down the recent transaction history, the glowing screen blurring slightly as tears of pure rage pricked the corners of my eyes. While I was bleeding out on an operating table, Garrett had been very busy. There was a charge for $800 at an upscale steakhouse in downtown Richmond. That must have been the major client dinner he could not possibly leave while I was in surgery. Below that, there was a charge for $3,000 at a high-end boutique jeweler. I stared at that number for a long time, trying to understand what kind of man buys expensive jewelry while his wife is fighting for her life in an emergency room. Then I saw the massive withdrawal. My breath hitched in my throat as I looked at our joint emergency savings account. The balance read 0. I refreshed the application twice, thinking it had to be a network error or a glitch in the hospital wireless internet. The screen reloaded. The balance remained a glaring, terrifying 0. 2 hours ago, Garrett had initiated a wire transfer draining all $42,000 of our emergency funds into a private external account that I did not recognize. He had taken everything I had saved over the last 5 years. Every deployment bonus, every hazard paycheck, every careful deposit I had made to ensure we had a solid financial safety net for the future. It was all gone. The financial foundation I had meticulously built with years of hard work and sacrifice had been erased in a matter of seconds. Garrett had effectively left me with nothing but the clothes I had arrived in and a military identification card. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, mixing with the lingering chill of the anesthesia. I was lying in a private civilian medical center. Because the base hospital had suffered a catastrophic power failure earlier that day, emergency dispatch had routed my ambulance directly to this out-of-network facility. My military insurance would cover a small fraction of the cost, but the emergency out-of-network fees, the specialized surgical team, and the extended private recovery room were going to result in a massive, crushing copay. I knew exactly how the healthcare system worked. I was looking at a medical bill that would easily exceed $30,000, and my husband had just stripped away my ability to pay for even a standard medical deductible. I dropped the phone onto my lap, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The intense physical pain in my stomach was completely eclipsed by a deep, suffocating panic. Garrett knew exactly what he was doing. He knew I was in a civilian hospital. He knew the heavy financial burden that was about to crash down on me. By emptying our bank accounts while I was unconscious, he was ensuring that I would wake up entirely dependent on him. He wanted me trapped, financially crippled, and begging for his help the moment I was discharged. It was a calculated, vicious financial ambush designed to punish me for the sheer inconvenience of my medical emergency. I closed my eyes, taking slow, measured breaths to calm my racing heart. I refused to let him break me. I ran through tactical scenarios in my head, treating my own life like one of my highly classified base transport manifests. I needed to call the bank fraud department immediately. I needed to freeze my military direct deposits so he could not steal my next paycheck. I needed to figure out a payment plan with the hospital billing department before they demanded a credit card on file. I was a senior logistics officer. I solved complex, seemingly impossible problems every single day of my life. I could absolutely solve this. I had to solve this immediately. Before I could formulate a complete plan, a soft, hesitant knock echoed from the heavy wooden door of my hospital room. I quickly wiped my eyes and adjusted my posture, ignoring the sharp, tearing pull of my surgical stitches. I expected another nurse to come in with a blood pressure cuff or intravenous fluids. Instead, the door opened slowly to reveal a tall woman in a crisp navy blue business suit. She wore a laminated badge identifying her as the hospital patient accounts manager. My stomach dropped into a bottomless pit of dread. They were already coming to collect the money. I braced myself for the humiliating conversation, mentally preparing to explain that my husband had just stolen my life savings and I needed a desperate hardship extension to pay my medical bills. She walked quietly to the side of my bed, her expression professional, but surprisingly warm. But she was not holding a clipboard. She did not have a stack of itemized medical bills in her hands. In fact, her hands were entirely empty of any standard hospital paperwork. Instead, she was holding a heavy rectangular box wrapped in dark, luxurious velvet. The woman stepped closer to the edge of my bed, her low heels making absolutely no sound against the polished linoleum floor. I braced myself for the inevitable clipboard, anticipating the stack of forms that would officially drown me in medical debt. I was mentally preparing to ask for the financial hardship paperwork, my throat dry and tight with humiliation. But she did not hand me a clipboard. She gently placed a velvet-wrapped box on the rolling tray table, hovering over my lap. The fabric was midnight blue and incredibly soft-looking, entirely out of place in a sterile medical facility. I stared at the box, then looked up at her, my confusion overriding my panic. I told her my husband had drained my accounts and I needed a payment plan immediately. The accounts manager offered a soft, reassuring smile that actually reached her eyes. She pulled a single piece of paper from the pocket of her tailored suit jacket and laid it next to the velvet box. It was an official hospital invoice, stamped with bold black ink across the top right corner. The stamp read, "Paid in full." I blinked, staring at the number at the bottom of the page. The total surgical and recovery cost was $45,000. The balance owed was exactly zero. I asked if my military insurance provider had somehow intervened. The manager shook her head slowly. Less than an hour ago, an older gentleman arrived at the hospital billing department in a black town car, accompanied by private security. He walked directly up to the billing counter, provided my full legal name, and paid the entire balance in cash. My mind raced through every possible scenario. Every commanding officer or distant relative who might possibly have the means to do something like this. The list was entirely improbable. I asked her if the man had left a name or a contact number. She told me he specifically requested to remain anonymous to the hospital staff. But he did leave the velvet box, and he gave her strict instructions to deliver it to me personally the moment I was awake and coherent. The manager paused, her professional demeanor softening into genuine curiosity. She leaned in slightly and told me that the man had also left a very specific message. He asked her to look me directly in the eye and say, "Tell her this changes everything." The accounts manager gave me a polite nod and quietly exited the room. I reached out my fingertips, brushing the soft material. The box was surprisingly heavy with the solid, substantial weight of something valuable. The message echoed in my mind. "Tell her this changes everything." I did not know who the stranger was or why he had paid a massive fortune to clear my medical debt. But for the first time since waking up in this hospital room, the suffocating grip of panic began to loosen. Garrett had tried to trap me by financially crippling me while I was unconscious. He had tried to leave me drowning in debt, dependent on his mercy and forced to beg. Instead, a complete stranger had just obliterated his strategy. Before my fingers could even pull the ribbon loose, the heavy wooden door to my room flew open with a violent, sudden force that made me jump. My mother-in-law Beverly marched into the room like a general inspecting a poorly maintained barracks. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored cream-colored pantsuit, her blonde hair sprayed into a rigid, unmoving style that defied gravity. She held a cheap, wilted bouquet of grocery store carnations wrapped in crinkling cellophane. Beverly did not pause at the foot of the bed. She did not ask how I was feeling or if the surgery had been successful. Instead, she let out an exaggerated theatrical sigh of absolute martyrdom and tossed the wilted flowers onto the edge of my bed. She immediately launched into a bitter, breathless complaint about the terrible inconvenience of having to drive to a civilian hospital in this unfamiliar part of town just for me. I watched her perform her usual routine of narcissistic victimhood, my face entirely blank. For 6 years, I had tolerated Beverly's constant passive-aggressive attacks. I had always deferred to her out of respect for Garrett, desperate to keep the peace and be the agreeable, accommodating daughter-in-law she so clearly wanted. But looking at her now, knowing what I knew about her son, the polite facade I had maintained for years completely crumbled into dust. Beverly finally stopped pacing and turned her sharp, judgmental gaze toward me. Her eyes narrowed as she crossed her arms over her chest, the heavy gold bracelets on her wrists clinking loudly. She leaned forward, her voice dropping into a cold, reprimanding tone. She said that Garrett had an incredibly important week ahead of him at Montgomery Defense Solutions, and my little health scare was causing unnecessary chaos at home. She looked me dead in the eye and delivered the exact kind of cruel, invalidating statement I had come to expect from her family. She sneered and said Garrett is absolutely exhausted from covering for your dramatic little hospital stunt. A dramatic little hospital stunt. My appendix had ruptured. I had been rushed into an emergency operating room to save my life. And Beverly was standing here looking at my surgical dressings, calling it a selfish, dramatic stunt designed to inconvenience her precious son. In the past, a comment like that would have stung deeply. It would have made me question myself, forcing me to apologize for being a burden. I would have promised that I would be back on my feet and managing the household chores in no time. But today was different. The woman who had cared about Beverly's approval had died the moment Dr. Gallagher played that emergency dispatch recording. The woman who wanted to save this marriage had vanished the moment she saw the drained savings account on her phone screen. I did not argue with her. Instead, I kept my eyes locked on hers. I slowly moved my hands under the thin, scratchy hospital blanket, taking the heavy, velvet-wrapped box with me. I quietly slid the stranger's gift down beside my leg, concealing it completely from her view. I let a slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was the sharp, dangerous smile of an adversary who realizes the enemy has vastly underestimated them. Beverly blinked, her confident posture faltering slightly at my uncharacteristic reaction. She did not expect me to look at her with such calm calculation. I realized in that exact moment that the battle lines had just been officially drawn. Garrett and his family thought they had me cornered. They thought they had drained my resources, isolated me in a hospital bed, and broken my spirit entirely. They expected me to be financially crippled and desperate for their validation. They were dead wrong. I was no longer the dutiful, accommodating wife fighting an unarmed war against their toxicity. I had my military discipline, a burning, unquenchable anger, and the mysterious velvet box. I knew my days of playing the victim were permanently over. Beverly studied my smile as if it were a language she could not understand. For years, she had known exactly how to make me retreat. A lifted eyebrow, a disappointed sigh, one sharp remark about my career, and I would begin explaining myself. This time I gave her nothing. The silence stretched until even she seemed uncomfortable. She glanced toward the blanket covering my legs, suspicious that I might be hiding something. But before she could step closer, the door opened and a nurse entered carrying a medication tray. Her name badge read, Elena. She took one look at Beverly's rigid posture, then at my face, and immediately understood that the room was not calm. Elena asked whether I wanted my visitor to remain. Beverly answered before I could speak. She said she was family and had every right to be there. I kept my eyes on the nurse and said very clearly that I wanted the visit ended. Beverly's expression tightened. She accused me of being ungrateful, unstable, and overly sensitive from the anesthesia. Elena did not argue. She pressed the call button beside the door and informed Beverly that hospital policy required all visitors to leave when a patient requested privacy. For the first time that day, Beverly looked genuinely embarrassed. She lowered her voice and warned me that Garrett would hear about my behavior. She said he was already carrying enough pressure without having to manage an irrational wife. I reached for my phone, activated the voice recorder, and placed it openly on the tray table between us. Then I asked her to repeat herself. Her confidence faltered. I told her that from that moment forward, every conversation involving Garrett money, my health, or my property would be documented. I did not threaten her. I did not need to. The small red recording symbol glowing on the screen was enough. Beverly stared at it, then at me, and seemed to realize that the rules had changed. A hospital security officer appeared at the door. Beverly gathered her handbag and straightened her cream-colored jacket with trembling hands. Before leaving, she leaned toward me and whispered that I would regret humiliating her. I answered that the only humiliation in the room belonged to people who mocked a patient for surviving emergency surgery. She left without another word. When the door finally closed, the room became quiet again. Elena checked my intravenous line, adjusted the monitor, and asked whether I felt safe returning home. The question was simple, but it cut through me with more force than Beverly's insults. I had spent years describing Garrett as difficult, demanding, ambitious, or emotionally distant. I had never used the word unsafe. Lying there with fresh surgical wounds, an empty bank account, and a recording of my husband telling doctors not to call unless I was dead, I could no longer avoid the truth. I told Elena that I was not sure. She nodded without judgment and brought me a hospital resource packet for patients experiencing domestic or financial abuse. I almost laughed at the phrase. Garrett had never struck me. He did not need to. He controlled money access, appearances, and information. He isolated me by making every concern sound unreasonable. He punished resistance by withdrawing affection, threatening my career, or turning his family against me. The packet gave names to tactics I had spent 6 years excusing. I placed it beside the velvet box, then I began making calls. My first call was to the bank's fraud division. I identified myself using my military credentials and reported the unauthorized transfer from our emergency savings account. The representative placed an immediate security hold on the external destination account and opened a formal investigation. Because my deposits had funded most of the account, she advised me to send records of my military pay deployment bonuses and previous transfers. I had all of them archived in a secure cloud folder. Logistics officers kept documentation. Garrett had always mocked that habit. Now it became my first line of defense. My second call was to military finance. I changed my direct deposit instructions, removed the joint account, and redirected every future payment into a new account that Garrett could not access. I changed the passwords to my retirement portal, insurance account, and personal email. I revoked every shared device connected to my financial profile. Each confirmation message felt like another lock sliding into place. My third call was to Major Ellis, my commanding officer. He had already heard about the surgery and answered immediately. I gave him the facts without dramatizing them. Garrett had refused the hospital's emergency call. He had emptied our savings while I was unconscious. I believed returning home might expose me to further financial interference. Major Ellis did not ask why I had stayed married. He did not tell me to calm down or think about Garrett's reputation. He asked what resources I needed. He offered temporary quarters on base, transportation, and assistance from the Legal Services Office. The professionalism in his voice nearly broke the control I had fought to maintain. I thanked him and requested that an officer retrieve my work laptop, uniforms, and essential records if I could not safely access the house myself. He agreed and told me not to make any decision alone. After the calls, exhaustion finally settled over me. My body was still weak and every breath pulled against the surgical dressings. Elena helped me sit higher against the pillows and brought a cup of ice chips. She glanced at the velvet box but did not ask what it contained. I appreciated that restraint. I ran my fingers over the dark fabric. The package was heavy enough to contain metal documents or both. A narrow ribbon crossed the lid, sealed beneath a small disc of red wax. Pressed into the wax was an unfamiliar crest, a shield divided by a single vertical sword. There was no name, no return address, and no explanation beyond the message delivered by the accounts manager. This changes everything. I wanted to open it immediately. Curiosity burned through me, but instinct told me not to do it in a hospital room where people entered without warning and Garrett's family knew my location. Whatever the stranger had left was valuable enough to accompany a $45,000 payment. It deserved privacy caution and a clear head. I wrapped the box inside a spare hospital blanket and placed it at the bottom of my military duffel bag. Then I zipped the bag closed and looped the strap around the bed frame. It was not elegant security, but it would force anyone trying to take it to wake me. Dr. Gallagher returned shortly before midnight. He reviewed my latest blood work and warned me that the infection markers were improving, but I still needed observation. He recommended another full day in the hospital. I asked what signs would indicate immediate danger if I left early. His eyes narrowed, recognizing the question behind the question. He listed fever, dizziness, increased abdominal pain, drainage, shortness of breath, and confusion. Then he asked whether someone reliable would be with me. I told him transportation and emergency support were already arranged. That was true. Major Ellis had made certain of it. But I was done allowing Garrett to control the timing of my decisions. Every additional hour gave him more opportunity to move money, alter documents, or establish a false story about my condition. He had already told his family that my surgery was a dramatic stunt. By morning, he could easily begin telling others that the anesthesia had made me unstable. Dr. Gallagher made me promise not to lift anything or ignore any worsening symptoms. I promised. He documented the conversation and left with visible reluctance. Sleep came in short, fractured intervals. Each time I woke, I checked that the duffel bag was still secured and reviewed the confirmations on my phone. At 3:17 in the morning, the bank notified me that the external transfer had been flagged for enhanced review. At 4:05, Military Finance confirmed my new account. At 4:40, Major Ellis sent a message stating that transportation and legal support were available whenever I requested them. For the first time since hearing Garrett's voice on the recording, I felt something stronger than anger. I felt structure. By dawn, I had created a written timeline of every event: the onset of pain, the ambulance transfer, the hospital's calls. Garrett's response, the emptied account, Beverly's statements, and the anonymous payment. I saved copies in 3 separate locations and sent one encrypted file to Major Ellis. If Garrett tried to rewrite what had happened, he would be fighting timestamps, recordings, financial records, and witnesses. The sky beyond the hospital window gradually shifted from black to a thin winter gray. Nurses changed shifts in the corridor. Carts rolled past the door. Somewhere nearby, a machine chimed steadily. I sat upright, pale and sore, with the duffel bag at my feet and a discharge form waiting on the tray. I still did not know who had paid my bill. I still did not know what rested inside the velvet box. But I knew exactly what Garrett expected. He expected me to leave the hospital frightened, broke, ashamed, and ready to beg him for help. Instead, I would return with my finances secured, my evidence preserved, and a secret he did not know existed. When the first nurse of the morning entered my room, the completed discharge form was already resting on the tray. I did not wait for Dr. Gallagher to formally release me the next morning. I signed myself out of the hospital against strict medical advice, moving with a stiff, carefully calculated precision to protect my torn abdominal muscles. I tucked the heavy velvet box safely into the bottom of my military duffel bag, zipped the canvas fabric shut, and hailed a taxi to take me back to my own house. I say my own house because that is exactly what it was. I had purchased the sprawling 4-bedroom colonial property in the suburbs entirely, with my hard-earned military veterans loan long before Garrett ever moved his things inside. He loved to parade around the manicured front lawn and admire the expensive hardwood floors, as if he had built the entire place with his bare hands. The absolute truth was that his name was not on a single piece of the mortgage paperwork. The taxi pulled into my long driveway just as the cold afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the barren winter tree line. I expected the house to be completely dark and quiet. I expected to find Garrett nursing a hangover or sulking in his home office after avoiding my medical crisis. Instead, my driveway was completely packed with luxury sedans and sleek sports cars. The front door was slightly ajar, and the unmistakable pulsing sound of jazz music and loud booming laughter drifted out onto the front porch. It was Tuesday evening. Thanksgiving was just 2 days away. Garrett was throwing a party. I pushed the front door open, gripping the fabric handle of my duffel bag tightly to ground myself against the sharp, burning pain radiating across my stomach. The entryway smelled of expensive catered food, roasted garlic, and rich, heavy cologne. I walked slowly into the main living room, still wearing my wrinkled hospital discharge clothes, my face pale and entirely devoid of makeup. The room was packed with at least 30 people. I recognized several of the faces immediately. They were senior corporate executives, wealthy defense contractors, and high-value clients from Montgomery Defense Solutions. Garrett had not canceled his precious pre-Thanksgiving corporate cocktail mixer. He had simply carried on with his networking agenda, as if his wife was not lying in a hospital bed, recovering from emergency surgery. He was standing near the massive stone fireplace, holding a crystal glass of expensive bourbon, regaling a small group of older men with some exaggerated, arrogant story. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his dark hair impeccably styled, looking every bit the successful corporate titan. Then he turned his head and saw me. I watched his eyes widen in genuine, unfiltered shock, his confident posture faltering for a mere fraction of a second. But Garrett was a masterful, deeply manipulative corporate salesman. Within the span of a single heartbeat, he completely shifted his entire demeanor. He set his crystal glass down on the wooden mantel with a loud, dramatic clink and rushed across the crowded living room toward me. His handsome face contorted into a mask of pure, frantic concern. He threw his arms around my shoulders, pulling me into a gentle, highly performative embrace that was designed entirely for the audience currently watching our reunion. He raised his voice just enough so that the surrounding executives could hear his feigned distress. He asked me what on earth I was doing out of bed, claiming he had been sick with worry all night and had only hosted this gathering because the clients were already in town and expecting to be entertained. He kissed the top of my head, playing the role of the terrified, deeply doting husband to absolute perfection. Several of his corporate colleagues offered sympathetic, warm smiles, raising their glasses in a silent, respectful toast to my safe return from the brink of tragedy. Garrett kept his arm tightly wrapped around my waist, his fingers digging uncomfortably hard into my side beneath my loose jacket. He told the crowd to please excuse us for a moment, while he made absolutely sure his brave, resilient wife was settled and comfortable in her own home. He steered me away from the bright living room, guiding me down the hallway and pushing firmly through the swinging wooden door into the kitchen. The moment the heavy door closed behind us, completely cutting off the view of his wealthy corporate audience, the loving, terrified husband entirely vanished into thin air. His warm, concerned expression melted away, replaced instantly by a look of absolute seething disgust. He dropped his arm from my waist and took a large step back, as if simply touching my hospital clothes was entirely repulsive to him. He crossed his arms over his broad chest and glared down at me, his jaw clenching with barely suppressed fury. He demanded to know what on earth I was thinking by walking into his elite networking event looking like a disheveled homeless person. He did not ask how my ruptured appendix surgery went. He did not ask if I was still in blinding pain. He launched directly into a vicious whispered tirade about how deeply I had just embarrassed him in front of the most important clients of his entire professional career. I stood completely still, leaning my weight against the cool granite countertop, watching the thick vein in his neck pulse with arrogant anger. He leaned in closer, his voice dripping with pure venom and condescension. He told me that my little dramatic medical stunt was going to cost him thousands of dollars in momentum, and he could not believe I would be so selfish as to ruin his carefully planned evening. He pointed a sharp finger inches from my face, his breath hot and angry against my cheek. He berated me for allowing the ambulance dispatch to take me to a civilian facility instead of waiting for the military base hospital to resolve their massive power failure. He harshly reminded me that his premium corporate insurance plan did not cover out-of-network emergency care, and he furiously declared that he was not going to pay a single dime of the massive medical bill I had just recklessly accumulated. He accused me of always finding a way to maliciously ruin his professional milestones with my constant need for attention and my poorly timed physical weakness. He told me that I was a heavy anchor continuously dragging down his limitless potential. He sharply ordered me to immediately go upstairs, take a hot shower to wash off the hospital stench, and stay completely hidden in the upstairs guest bedroom until every single one of his important clients had finally left the property. I did not flinch or shrink away from his aggressive posture. I did not shed a single tear of hurt or betrayal. I just looked at the man I had spent 6 arduous years trying to please, realizing how remarkably small, cruel, and pathetic he actually was beneath his expensive suits and inflated corporate titles. The fear that used to control me had completely vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I slowly stood up straight, ignoring the sharp, tearing pull of my fresh surgical stitches. I felt the comforting weight of the velvet box, hidden safely inside my duffel bag, pressing heavily against my leg. I let a long, tense moment of silence stretch between us, allowing my absolute lack of submission to unnerve him. Then I stared him dead in the eye, holding his gaze until he blinked first. My voice was deadly calm, entirely devoid of emotion and perfectly steady. As the words sliced through the quiet kitchen air, I said, "I thought I was not supposed to come back unless I was dead." Garrett stood completely frozen. The color instantly drained from his handsome face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost under the bright kitchen lights. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He knew exactly what I was quoting. He knew that I had heard the emergency dispatch recording. The arrogant pulsing vein in his neck suddenly stopped. He forced a strained, nervous laugh and ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He told me that I was clearly confused from the heavy hospital medications. He said I was hallucinating conversations that never happened and that I needed to go upstairs to rest before I embarrassed myself any further. Before I could even begin to tell him that his gaslighting was not going to work ever again, the heavy wooden kitchen door swung open. Beverly and his sister Felicity pushed their way into the room. Felicity was a younger, more aggressive version of Beverly. Beverly immediately stepped between Garrett and me, acting as a protective shield for her fully grown son. She demanded to know why I was cornering him in the kitchen when he had a house full of important guests to entertain. Garrett quickly played the victim. He told his mother and sister that my surgical painkillers were making me hysterical and paranoid. He claimed I was making up terrible lies about him to ruin his big networking event. Felicity rolled her eyes and took a long sip of her wine. She looked me up and down, taking in my wrinkled hospital clothes and pale face. She told me I was being incredibly selfish and dramatic. She said Garrett had been working around the clock finalizing a multi-million-dollar defense contract to support this family while I was busy taking a nap in a hospital bed. Beverly chimed in, agreeing completely with her daughter. They stood there forming a united front of toxic loyalty. I remained completely deadpan. I did not raise my voice or try to defend my trauma. I simply stared at them until the uncomfortable silence made Felicity shift nervously on her feet. The tense standoff was broken by the sharp chime of the front doorbell echoing down the hallway. His posture instantly straightened. A wave of relief washed over his face as he eagerly excused himself from the kitchen, claiming he needed to greet a very special guest who had just arrived. Beverly and Felicity followed close behind him, their faces brightening with sudden enthusiasm. I waited a moment before following them out into the main hallway. I stood near the edge of the living room watching the entryway. Garrett opened the heavy front door and welcomed a young woman inside. He introduced her to the surrounding executives as his new executive assistant, Courtney. Courtney appeared to be no older than 24. She had long, flowing blonde hair and wore a tight-fitted emerald green cocktail dress that seemed entirely inappropriate for a corporate networking event. She stepped into the house with an air of overwhelming confidence and extreme familiarity. She did not shake his hand like a normal employee. Instead, she reached out and affectionately squeezed his bicep, leaning in close to whisper something in his ear that made him laugh warmly. Beverly and Felicity rushed forward to greet her. They enveloped Courtney in warm, enthusiastic hugs, treating her like a beloved family member who had just returned from a long journey. They complimented her dress, her hair, and her perfume. They offered her the kind of genuine warmth and glowing respect they had systematically denied me for 6 entire years. As Courtney reached up to tuck a stray strand of blonde hair behind her ear, The hallway chandelier light caught something sparkling on her wrist. I froze. My eyes locked onto the piece of jewelry resting against her tanned skin. It was a stunning, heavy diamond tennis bracelet. The design was incredibly specific, featuring a unique alternating pattern of round and emerald-cut stones. I recognized the jewelry instantly. My heart beat a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs as the realization clicked firmly into place. 2 months ago, I had found a strange charge for $3,000 on my joint credit card statement from a boutique jeweler downtown. When I confronted Garrett about it, he had acted completely shocked and outraged. He claimed it was a fraudulent charge from identity thieves and promised me he was working closely with the bank fraud department to investigate it. He had looked me right in the eyes and lied without a single ounce of hesitation. And now the result of that fraudulent charge was sparkling brightly on the wrist of his young assistant right inside my own home. Then Courtney noticed me standing quietly near the edge of the living room. She confidently walked over to me, a condescending smile playing on her glossy lips. Garrett trailed nervously behind her, his eyes darting between the diamond bracelet and my face. Courtney introduced herself, extending a perfectly manicured hand. I refused it. She looked me up and down, taking in my wrinkled hospital discharge clothes with a look of profound pity. She told me she had heard all about my little health scare and hoped I was feeling better. Then she leaned in, slightly lowering her voice as if she were sharing a valuable secret between friends. She told me that the corporate world was incredibly demanding, and that men like Garrett carried the weight of the world on their shoulders. She told me that keeping a successful man happy meant knowing when to step back, stay out of his way, and create a peaceful environment for him to thrive in. Beverly and Felicity stood a few feet away, watching the interaction with smug, satisfied expressions. They were thoroughly enjoying my humiliation. They loved seeing me put in my place by a younger, prettier woman who clearly held his attention and affection. Garrett stood there, letting his mistress disrespect his wife in front of his family and his colleagues. He did not say a word to defend me. He simply watched, waiting to see if I would cause a scene and prove his theory that I was hysterical and unstable. I did not cause a scene. I did not scream or cry or point out the stolen diamond bracelet on her wrist. I did not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply looked at Courtney and thanked her for her insightful advice. I told her I would be sure to keep it in mind. I turned to Garrett and politely excused myself, saying I needed to rest. I walked away from the crowded living room, maintaining a slow, steady pace despite the physical pain radiating through my abdomen. I climbed the wooden staircase to the second floor, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses fading slightly with each step. I walked down the hallway and entered my private home office. It was the only room in the house that was entirely mine. I stepped inside and pushed the heavy oak door shut. I turned the brass lock, hearing a satisfying solid click that isolated me from the toxic chaos downstairs. The room was dark and quiet. I walked over to the large leather chair behind my desk and carefully sat down. I reached into my canvas duffel bag, resting on the floor. My fingers brushed against the soft, dark fabric. I then slowly pulled the heavy velvet-wrapped box from the bag and placed it directly in the center of my desk. I turned on the small brass reading lamp, casting a warm pool of light over the mysterious package. I reached out and grabbed the edge of the thick satin ribbon binding the box. I took a deep breath, steadying my hands. I pulled the ribbon, breaking the seal completely. The hidden latch released beneath my thumb with a soft, metallic click. I lifted the velvet lid, ready to discover exactly what kind of power the anonymous stranger had given me. Inside the box, resting on a bed of dark, rich satin, was a thick stack of heavy cream-colored paper. It looked like a collection of formal legal parchment bound tightly together with a thick brown leather strap. Resting directly on top of the legal documents was a single sealed envelope made of expensive, textured stationery. My name, Jillian, was written across the front of the envelope in a sharp, elegant script that I did not recognize. I set the velvet lid aside and picked up the envelope. My fingers were trembling slightly, but I forced them to remain steady. I slid my thumbnail under the thick flap and broke the red wax seal. Inside was a handwritten letter that spanned 3 pages. I unfolded the heavy paper, smoothed it out flat on the surface of my wooden desk, under the warm glow of my reading lamp, and began to read. The letter was dated just 3 days ago. It began with a highly formal greeting, but the tone quickly shifted into something deeply personal and profoundly heartbroken. The signature at the very bottom of the last page caught my eye before I even finished reading the first paragraph. The name was Franklin Montgomery. My breath hitched in my throat. Franklin Montgomery was the reclusive billionaire founder and primary shareholder of Montgomery Defense Solutions. He was the absolute pinnacle of the corporate ladder that Garrett spent every waking moment trying to climb. Garrett worshipped the ground Franklin Montgomery walked on, despite the fact that the billionaire was known for being an incredibly private man who rarely interacted with his lower-level executives. My husband viewed the man as a god among mortals. I pulled my eyes back to the top of the first page and read the words carefully. Franklin Montgomery was writing to tell me a story about a young man named Arthur. I frowned, the name sparking a distant, hazy memory from my deployment in the Middle East 5 years ago. I kept reading, and the pieces of the past began to snap violently into place. During my second tour, I was managing a complex transport logistics hub on a secure forward operating base. We had a sudden, terrifying base lockdown. A localized threat had breached the outer perimeter, and the emergency sirens were blaring across the compound. Chaos erupted in the dusty streets. Amidst the sudden panic, I saw a young, terrified civilian contractor standing completely frozen in the open courtyard. He was paralyzed by fear, completely exposed to the unfolding danger. My military training kicked in automatically. I did not think about the risk to myself. I ran out from the reinforced command center, grabbed the young man by his heavy tactical vest, and physically dragged him behind the thick concrete barricades just seconds before the area was compromised by incoming fire. I stayed with him for 4 grueling hours in the dark, keeping him calm and focused until the all-clear signal was finally given. I never saw him again after that day. He was just another face in a chaotic deployment, a small moment of duty that I had long since filed away in the back of my mind. The letter in my hands revealed a truth I could never have possibly anticipated. That terrified civilian contractor was Franklin Montgomery's estranged son. The billionaire explained that Arthur had always wanted to prove himself outside of his father's massive corporate shadow, which was why he had taken a highly dangerous overseas contracting job under an assumed name. Franklin wrote about how Arthur had returned home safely because of my rapid response. He wrote about how his son had lived 5 more beautiful years, gotten married, and experienced a full life, all because a brave logistics officer had risked her own life to pull a complete stranger to safety. The tone of the letter grew noticeably heavier, the handwriting slightly less steady as I turned to the second page. Franklin explained that Arthur had recently passed away from a sudden, aggressive, and entirely unrelated illness. During his final painful days in the hospital, as Franklin sat quietly by his son's bedside, Arthur had recounted the story of the base lockdown. He told his father all about the woman who had saved him. He gave his father my full name and my specific military unit information. Franklin wrote that hearing his dying son speak with such profound gratitude about the extra years he had been given made him realize a massive debt he could never possibly repay. Arthur had asked his wealthy father to find me, to make absolutely sure I was safe and taken care of as a final dying wish. Franklin Montgomery explained that his own health was now rapidly failing. He had spent his entire life building Montgomery Defense Solutions into a global, unstoppable empire, but without his beloved son to share it with, the vast wealth meant absolutely nothing to him. He wrote that he had spent the last few weeks having his private investigators look deeply into my life. He knew all about my spotless military record, my clean background, and my absolute dedication to service. He also knew that I was currently recovering from emergency surgery, which was exactly why he had personally ensured my massive medical bills were completely erased. But that was simply a minor gesture of goodwill. The real gift was underneath the letter. Franklin instructed me to read the legal documents bound by the leather strap. I set the letter down on the desk, my hands shaking so violently I could barely untie the dark leather cord. I pulled the first document from the thick stack. It was a massive, irrevocable transfer of assets. I read the heavily legalized paragraphs, my eyes scanning the incredibly complex corporate jargon until I reached the final summary page. I read the words and then I read them again to make sure I was not hallucinating from the surgical pain medication. Franklin Montgomery had just legally transferred 51% of his controlling shares in his global empire directly to me. I traced my fingers over the printed numbers. I read the official notary stamps, the crisp signatures, and the embossed corporate seals. The reality of the documents crashed over me like a massive, unstoppable tidal wave. I was no longer just an Army logistics officer struggling to pay a medical bill. I was the majority shareholder of a multi-billion-dollar defense contracting firm. I was the supreme authority over the entire board of directors. I placed the documents back onto the desk and leaned deep into my leather chair. A slow, chilling realization washed over my entire body. I thought about Garrett standing downstairs in the living room, pouring expensive bourbon and trying to impress his bosses. I thought about how he had drained my bank accounts and treated me like a worthless burden. He loved his job more than he loved his wife. He worshipped his corporate status. I looked down at the documents illuminated by the reading lamp. He believed he held all the power in our marriage because he controlled our finances and dictated our social standing. He thought he had completely ruined my life while I was trapped in that hospital bed. But everything had changed. I now literally owned the company my husband worked for. I carefully folded the heavy parchment papers back into the velvet box. Downstairs, the muffled sounds of clinking glasses and Garrett boasting to his colleagues continued to vibrate through the floorboards. He was so completely absorbed in his own arrogant performance that he had absolutely no idea his entire world had just shifted beneath his feet. I knew that confronting him right now, armed only with raw emotion and a stack of unverified papers, would be a massive tactical error. In the military, you never engage the enemy until you have fully surveyed the battlefield and confirmed the functionality of your weapons. I needed absolute, undeniable verification. I needed a lawyer. I grabbed a thick, heavy wool coat from the back of my bedroom closet, wincing sharply as the sudden movement pulled painfully at my fresh surgical incisions. I carefully slipped my cell phone and the velvet box into a plain, unassuming leather tote bag. Moving with highly deliberate, agonizingly slow steps, I completely bypassed the grand main staircase. Our house had a secondary set of narrow stairs leading directly from the guest quarters down to the rear mudroom. I silently crept down the narrow wooden steps, holding my breath every single time the old floorboards groaned. I slipped out the heavy back door, the freezing winter air hitting my face like a sharp, sobering slap. I walked down the dark alley behind our subdivision and used a ride-sharing application to call a car, setting the pickup location 2 streets over to avoid any suspicion from Garrett or his wealthy guests. The ride into the city took 45 minutes, but the time seemed to evaporate as I meticulously formulated my strategy. I sat in the back of the quiet sedan, watching the dim suburban streetlights gradually bleed into the towering, illuminated glass skyscrapers of the downtown financial district. My mind was operating with a cold, pristine clarity that I had not felt since my most dangerous overseas deployments. For 6 entire years, I had allowed Garrett to convince me that I was merely a supporting character in his grand, important corporate narrative. He had continually demanded my absolute submission, mocked my dedicated military service, and strategically isolated me from my own hard-earned financial independence. He had used my loyalty as a weapon against me. Now, holding the heavy velvet box tightly against my chest, I realized I possessed the ultimate power to permanently dismantle his entire arrogant existence. The car pulled up to a sleek, imposing glass building in the heart of the corporate sector. I paid the driver and stepped out onto the busy sidewalk. The prestigious law firm of Harrison and Caldwell occupied the top 3 floors of the massive building. They were widely renowned across the eastern seaboard for exclusively handling the most secretive, high-stakes corporate litigation for global defense contractors. I walked confidently through the revolving glass doors and slowly approached the polished marble security desk in the expansive main lobby. I presented my military identification card and asked for Mr. Harrison. The security guard typed my name into his computer. His posture immediately straightened, and he respectfully escorted me directly to a private wood-paneled elevator reserved strictly for executive clients. The elevator doors chimed open on the penthouse floor. A tall, distinguished man with silver hair and an impeccably tailored navy suit was waiting for me in the foyer. He did not look at my wrinkled hospital discharge clothes or the dark, exhausted circles under my eyes. Instead, he stepped forward and extended his hand with a level of profound reverence that genuinely took me by surprise. He introduced himself as Arthur Harrison, the primary legal counsel for Franklin Montgomery. He spoke with a quiet, measured authority, guiding me down a quiet corridor lined with expensive modern art and sweeping views of the city skyline. We entered his massive corner office. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut, sealing us in complete privacy. He offered me a comfortable leather chair and a glass of sparkling water, treating me with the kind of deferential respect that my own husband had never once shown me. I set the velvet box onto the center of his polished glass desk. I told him that I needed to know if the documents inside were actually real. I needed to know if this was some kind of elaborate mistake or a cruel practical joke designed to humiliate me. Mr. Harrison offered a warm, reassuring smile. He sat down across from me and opened a thick manila folder resting on his desk. He looked me directly in the eyes and stated with absolute, unwavering certainty that there was no mistake. He explained that he had personally drafted the asset transfer documents under the direct, explicit instructions of Franklin Montgomery. The transfer of 51% of the controlling shares in Montgomery Defense Solutions was entirely ironclad, legally binding, and completely irreversible. It had already been filed with the federal regulatory commissions and approved by the highest levels of the corporate governance board. Mr. Harrison leaned forward, folding his hands together on the desk. He explained that Franklin Montgomery had spent his final days ensuring that absolutely no one could contest the transfer. The billionaire had provided extensive medical evaluations, proving his absolute mental competency, and he had structured the holding trust to bypass any standard corporate waiting periods. Mr. Harrison told me that I was not just a passive shareholder waiting for quarterly dividends. I was the absolute highest authority in the company. I had the power to appoint board members, dictate corporate strategy, and terminate any employee at any level without requiring a single secondary approval. He looked at me with deep professional admiration and formally addressed me as the majority shareholder and the chairwoman of the board. The reality of his words settled over me like a heavy protective armor. The terrified, vulnerable woman who had woken up alone in a hospital bed was completely gone. I sat up straighter in the leather chair, ignoring the throbbing pain in my abdomen. I looked at Mr. Harrison and decided it was time to test the absolute limits of my new authority. I told him that I needed to conduct an immediate, highly classified internal review of a specific senior executive. I gave him Garrett's full legal name and his exact corporate title within the firm. I did not explain my marital situation. I did not mention the drained savings accounts, the cruel dispatch recording, or the diamond bracelets sparkling on the wrist of his young assistant. I simply spoke with the cold, detached precision of a commanding officer demanding a thorough tactical briefing. I asked Mr. Harrison to use his corporate security clearance to pull Garrett's recent corporate expense reports, his internal company emails, and all of his travel logs for the past 12 months. I wanted to see every single transaction, every approved reimbursement, and every communication he had sent using company servers. Mr. Harrison did not question my motives. He did not hesitate or ask for clarification. He simply nodded, his expression shifting into a mask of sharp, focused professionalism. He stood up from his desk and walked over to a heavy fireproof safe secured in the corner of his office. He punched a complex numerical code into the electronic keypad and pulled open the heavy steel door. He reached inside and retrieved a surprisingly thick, overflowing manila folder. He walked back to the glass desk holding the file with both hands. The top of the folder was marked with a bold, bright red stamp indicating a highly classified internal security review. The sheer volume of the paperwork inside the folder suggested a massive, deeply troubling paper trail. Mr. Harrison did not look surprised by my request. In fact, he looked as though he had been quietly preparing for this exact moment. He sat back down in his leather chair and looked at me with a grim, serious expression. He placed his hand flat against the heavy manila folder and slowly slid it across the polished glass surface of the desk until it rested directly in front of me. He met my eyes, his voice low and incredibly steady. "Madam Chairwoman, your husband has been very busy and very careless." I stared down at the thick manila folder resting on the glass desk between us. The bold red stamp marking it as a classified internal security review seemed to pulse. My heart beat slowly as I rested my fingertips against the rough paper edge. I took a deep breath, pulling the folder toward me and flipped it open. The first few pages were standard expense reports, meticulously detailed and officially approved. But as I flipped further into the stack, the legitimate expenses quickly gave way to a labyrinth of highly questionable transactions. I scanned the documents with the trained eye of a military logistics officer who had spent years auditing complex supply chain manifests. I knew exactly what financial discrepancies looked like. The paperwork revealed a staggering network of dummy vendor accounts. Garrett had been siphoning money from Montgomery Defense Solutions for at least 4 years. He was authorizing massive payments to shell companies that provided absolutely no services to the firm. There were invoices for $50,000 here and $80,000 there, all approved directly under his executive credentials. I looked up at Mr. Harrison. He was watching me quietly, allowing me to process the magnitude of the theft. I asked him how much money Garrett had stolen in total. Mr. Harrison stated that their preliminary audit indicated the stolen funds exceeded $800,000. Garrett had been using the diverted money to fund his extravagant lifestyle. He paid for luxury cars, expensive country club memberships, custom-tailored suits, and diamond bracelets using stolen company cash. He had been playing the role of a wealthy corporate titan while operating as a common thief. A sharp wave of disgust washed over me. For 6 years, I had listened to him belittle my military career and mock my salary while he was secretly robbing his employer blind. But the simple act of embezzlement was not what made the air in the room feel incredibly thin. As I turned the pages, digging deeper into the financial forensic reports, I noticed a very specific pattern in the routing numbers. The stolen corporate funds were not being funneled into Garrett's personal bank accounts. They were being wired out of the country entirely. I pulled a bank statement from the middle of the folder and studied the recipient account information. It was an offshore holding account located in the Cayman Islands. I traced my finger across the printed text, reading the registered ownership details. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I read the name printed in stark black ink, and then I read it again to be certain my eyes were not deceiving me. The offshore account was registered under my name. I quickly grabbed the next statement, and then the next. Every single piece of banking documentation tied to the stolen funds was plastered with my personal information. I found copies of documents displaying my full legal name, my social security number, and my highly classified military identification number. Garrett had not just been stealing money from Montgomery Defense Solutions. He had methodically opened a complex network of illegal offshore accounts, using my stolen identity to hide his tracks. The terrifying reality of what I was looking at crashed down on me with the force of a physical blow. Garrett was not just a greedy corporate criminal. He was a deeply calculating sociopath. He had spent 4 years actively framing me for his massive federal crimes. He knew the defense contracting industry was heavily monitored by federal regulatory agencies and government auditors. He knew that if the missing hundreds of thousands of dollars were ever discovered by the company accountants, the digital paper trail would lead the federal investigators directly to my doorstep. He had positioned me to take the absolute full fall for his extensive embezzlement. I stared blankly at the polished glass surface of the desk, imagining the horrific scenario Garrett had orchestrated. If the federal authorities had uncovered this massive fraud, I would have been arrested immediately. I would have been dishonorably discharged from the military, stripped of my hard-earned pension, and completely disgraced in the national news. I would have faced decades in a federal prison for wire fraud, while Garrett walked away completely unscathed, playing the role of the shocked, innocent husband who had absolutely no idea his military wife was a master criminal. He had planned to completely destroy my entire life to save his own skin without a single second of hesitation. I thought back to the emergency dispatch recording from the hospital. I thought about how irritated he sounded when they told him I was in critical condition. I thought about how he told the hospital staff not to call back unless I was dead. It all made a terrifying, sickening kind of sense now. If I had died on that operating table, his massive problem would have been permanently solved. The illegal offshore accounts would have belonged to a deceased woman. He would have played the grieving widower, collected my military life insurance, and walked away with hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen corporate funds hidden safely out of reach. My death would have been the ultimate perfect cover for his elaborate crimes. A profound, heavy silence filled the executive corner office. The lingering traces of sorrow, confusion, and heartbreak that had been weighing down my chest entirely evaporated. The woman who had cried over her broken marriage, over the cruel indifference of her mother-in-law, and over the presence of a mistress, was completely gone. Every single ounce of grief was incinerated in an instant, replaced by a cold, ruthless, tactical precision. I was no longer a wounded wife dealing with a cheating husband. I was an active-duty logistics officer facing a hostile enemy combatant who had just attempted to permanently destroy my life. I carefully gathered the scattered financial documents and tapped the edges against the glass desk, aligning them into a perfect, neat stack. I slid the paperwork back into the folder and closed the cover, pressing my hand firmly against the bold red classified stamp. I did not shed a single tear. I did not shake or tremble. My posture straightened automatically, aligning into a rigid, disciplined military stance, despite the sharp, throbbing ache of my fresh surgical wounds. I looked across the desk at Mr. Harrison. He was watching me with a look of deep professional respect, clearly recognizing the profound internal shift that had just occurred. He saw that I was no longer processing the shock of the betrayal. I was actively calculating my counter-offensive. I kept my voice incredibly calm, steady, and entirely devoid of any emotion. I asked Mr. Harrison to confirm that as the majority shareholder and chairwoman of the board, I possess the absolute legal authority to terminate any executive within the company immediately. Mr. Harrison nodded slowly, confirming that my authority was absolute and superseded all existing corporate employment contracts. I then asked him to confirm that we possessed enough concrete, verifiable evidence to immediately involve federal investigators regarding the stolen funds. He nodded again, stating that the paper trail was undeniably thorough and completely actionable. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs. I looked at the dark city skyline right outside his massive corner office window. The long war was about to begin. I told Mr. Harrison to prepare the board. I told him I was absolutely ready. I stepped out of the towering glass skyscraper and back into the freezing winter air of the downtown financial district. The quiet ride back to the suburbs felt entirely different from my panicked journey into the city just a few hours earlier. I was no longer a betrayed, vulnerable wife, desperately seeking answers in the dark. I was a commanding officer returning to enemy territory, fully armed, fully informed, and perfectly aware of the battlefield layout. I sat in the back of the hired sedan, watching the streetlights pass over the dark windows. My mind was rapidly processing the sheer magnitude of Garrett's betrayal. He was not just unfaithful. He was actively trying to send me to federal prison to cover his own massive corporate theft. When the car finally pulled into my long driveway, the luxury sedans and expensive sports cars were entirely gone. The corporate networking event had ended. The house was quiet, but the exterior lights were still blazing bright against the dark night sky. The frost was already beginning to settle across the expansive front lawn, turning the grass a pale, shimmering white under the glow of the street lamps. I took a deep, steadying breath, preparing myself for the final performance. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped inside. The warm air still smelled faintly of expensive catered food, freshly spilled bourbon, and the heavily lingering cloying scent of Courtney's cheap floral perfume. I moved silently through the foyer, taking off my heavy winter coat and carefully hanging it in the hall closet. My fresh surgical wounds throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, but I barely noticed the physical discomfort anymore. My mind was entirely consumed by the tactical execution of the upcoming days. I walked slowly into the main living room and found Garrett sitting comfortably in his favorite leather armchair. He was holding a fresh glass of amber bourbon, his silk tie loosened, and his posture radiating an overwhelming sense of arrogant satisfaction. He had clearly interpreted my quiet departure earlier in the evening as complete and utter submission. He truly thought my silence in front of his young mistress and his enabling family was a definitive sign that I had finally accepted my lowly place beneath his heel. He did not know that I had just spent the last few hours looking at his offshore bank accounts and federal fraud schemes with a billionaire corporate lawyer. Garrett set his crystal glass down on the wooden coffee table and stood up. He did not ask where I had been or how my pain levels were. He simply assumed I had been hiding upstairs, crying, and feeling sorry for myself just as he had cruelly ordered me to do. He walked over to a heavy oak side table and picked up a thick stack of printed legal documents. He approached me with a patronizing, sympathetic smile that made my stomach churn with absolute disgust. He told me that my dramatic little medical crisis had forced him to think very seriously about our financial future. He said that watching me collapse and end up in a substandard civilian hospital had made him realize how incredibly fragile and unpredictable my life could be. Garrett handed me the thick stack of papers, pressing them firmly into my hands. He casually explained that they were real estate transfer deeds. He looked me up and down with a condescending sneer and told me that my high-stress military job and my sudden physical incompetence proved that I was no longer capable of properly managing our major financial assets. He conveniently ignored the absolute fact that I had purchased this sprawling four-bedroom house entirely by myself, using my hard-earned military veterans loan long before we were even married. His name was not on a single piece of the original mortgage paperwork. He told me that to protect our future, he had his personal lawyers draft a comprehensive family trust. He demanded that I sign the deed of my house over to this trust immediately. He casually mentioned that his mother Beverly would be the primary executor and sole manager of the trust because she had the abundant free time and the superior financial acumen to manage the valuable property responsibly. He claimed my military duties made me too erratic to handle homeownership. I stared down at the crisp white papers in my hands. The sheer audacity of his greed was almost breathtaking to witness. He was actually trying to legally steal my house, right after spending 4 years trying to frame me for federal embezzlement. I realized instantly that he was frantically trying to tie up all his loose ends. He wanted to strip me of my last remaining asset before the federal authorities inevitably caught wind of his missing corporate funds. I looked up at him, keeping my facial expression perfectly blank and unreadable. I asked him exactly when he wanted me to sign the property transfer. Garrett smiled broadly, clearly thrilled by my apparent lack of resistance. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, and told me that Thanksgiving dinner was tomorrow night at his mother's suburban mansion. He said it would be a beautiful symbolic gesture of family unity if we signed the legal papers together in front of all our distinguished guests. He wanted to use the massive holiday gathering to publicly demonstrate that I was willingly surrendering control of my life to his superior family. He wanted his wealthy corporate colleagues and his toxic relatives to see me playing the pathetic role of the helpless, grateful wife who desperately needed her successful husband to protect her from her own glaring incompetence. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was laying a highly public trap to completely humiliate me and strip me of my independence. But he had absolutely no idea that he was actually building the perfect stage for his own absolute public execution. I looked down at the hardwood floor, forcing my shoulders to slump in a highly convincing posture of complete defeat. I made my voice sound small, hesitant, and entirely broken as I spoke. I told him that he was absolutely right. I told him that the emergency surgery had taken a massive toll on my physical and mental health, and I just wanted to do whatever he thought was best to protect our family. I meekly agreed to sign the transfer papers at the grand Thanksgiving dinner tomorrow night. Garrett beamed with absolute triumph, his broad chest puffing out with pride. He reached out and patted my shoulder with the condescending fake affection a person might show a slow, obedient dog. He told me I was finally acting like a reasonable, supportive wife. He turned around and walked briskly toward the kitchen, pulling his cell phone from his tailored suit pocket. I watched him go, knowing with absolute certainty that he was immediately calling his young assistant Courtney to brag about how easily he had manipulated me into giving up my house. The moment the heavy kitchen door swung shut, my own phone vibrated softly in my coat pocket. I reached in and pulled it out. The bright screen illuminated the dark hallway with a single new text message from Mr. Harrison. I opened the secure message and read the words: "The federal authorities have been briefed. We strike tomorrow." I locked my phone and smiled quietly to myself in the very dark, entirely empty living room. I stared down at the thick, heavy stack of printed legal documents resting quietly next to my expensive crystal water goblet. The crisp white paper stood in stark contrast to the deep burgundy tablecloth and the elaborate spread of roasted turkey, warm cranberry stuffing, and incredibly expensive vintage wines. The polite applause from the corporate executives faded into a suffocating silence as every single eye at the long dining table turned to watch my reaction. Beverly was sitting at the opposite end of the table, holding her champagne flute near her chin, with a look of absolute triumph frozen on her perfectly manicured face. She had meticulously orchestrated this entire spectacle to ensure my complete and absolute public humiliation before her wealthy peers. Beside my husband sat Courtney, wearing a silk dress that cost more than my first car and a diamond bracelet that I now knew was purchased with stolen corporate funds. She was leaning forward slightly, her eyes gleaming with eager anticipation, waiting for the pathetic military wife to finally surrender her last remaining asset. Garrett tapped his perfectly polished fingernail against the top page of the thick property deed, indicating exactly where I was supposed to sign my name in black ink. The sheer arrogance radiating from his body was almost a physical force in the warm dining room. He truly believed he had won. He thought the psychological pressure of a dozen high-ranking colleagues and his overbearing mother would force me into immediate submission. He leaned closer to me, his voice dropping into a patronizing whisper that was loud enough for the executives seated nearest to us to hear clearly. "Go ahead and sign it, darling," he urged, gesturing toward the silver fountain pen resting near my plate. "It is the best thing for everyone. You know you have not been thinking clearly since the surgery, and this family trust will make sure you never have to worry about managing complex assets ever again. Mom has graciously agreed to handle all the administrative burdens so you can just focus on resting." The executives nodded in solemn agreement, murmuring their approval of his supposedly selfless gesture. One of the senior vice presidents, a man named Richard, who had always looked at me with thinly veiled disdain, raised his glass toward Garrett. "It is a highly strategic and incredibly smart move," he stated loudly for everyone to hear. "Real estate requires a sharp mind and constant vigilance. You are doing the right thing by protecting her from responsibilities she simply cannot handle right now." Beverly chimed in from the end of the table, her voice dripping with toxic sweetness. "We are your family, Jillian. We are just trying to keep you safe from your own erratic decisions. You have been so terribly confused lately, and Garrett has been carrying such a heavy burden taking care of you while preparing for his transition to vice president. The least you can do is let us manage the property to ease his mind." I looked from Beverly to Richard and finally to my husband. The layers of gaslighting were so thick they were almost choking me. They were actively constructing a public narrative that I was mentally incompetent, using my emergency surgery as the perfect excuse to strip away my financial independence. I reached out with a trembling hand, intentionally letting my fingers shake just enough for everyone at the table to notice. I picked up the heavy silver fountain pen, feeling the cool metal against my skin. Garrett exhaled a soft breath of relief, leaning back in his chair with a satisfied smirk. Courtney picked up her wine glass, taking a celebratory sip as she watched me uncap the pen. I stared down at the signature line on the property transfer deed. If I signed this document, I would legally hand over the only home I had ever truly owned to a woman who despised my very existence. I would be completely and hopelessly at their absolute mercy for the rest of my natural life. I let the tip of the pen hover just a fraction of an inch above the crisp white paper, allowing the silence in the room to stretch out until it became almost unbearably tense. I kept my head bowed, letting my hair fall forward to hide the cold, calculated expression taking over my face. I needed them to commit fully to this public performance. I needed every single executive at this table to remember exactly how Garrett behaved right before his entire world collapsed. I made my voice sound small, hesitant, and suitably broken. "You really think this is best for me?" I asked, looking up at Garrett through my eyelashes. He nodded quickly, placing his hand over mine in a display of fake affection that made my stomach churn. "I know it is," he promised smoothly. "I am about to take on massive new responsibilities at Montgomery Defense Solutions. I need to know our assets are secure so I can focus entirely on the firm. You signing this legal document tonight publicly proves that we are a perfectly united front. It proves you support my career." I lowered the pen, resting it gently on top of the document without making a single mark. I looked across the table at the executives who were watching this intimate marital exchange like spectators at a theater. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my shoulders to slump in a perfect imitation of a defeated woman. "I suppose I do not know very much at all about massive corporate responsibilities," I murmured, keeping my tone remarkably meek and agreeable. "But vice president is such an important role. You must be handling so many large accounts and critical financial transfers for the company right now." Garrett puffed out his chest, completely oblivious to the trap I was currently digging for him. "I handle millions of dollars in sensitive contracts every single quarter," he boasted loudly, making sure Richard and the other executives heard every word. "The firm relies on my exact precision. I manage massive budgets without a single oversight, which is exactly why I need absolute stability at home. I cannot have you making reckless financial choices with property while I am dealing with classified corporate funds." I nodded slowly, as if his blatantly condescending words made perfect logical sense. I slid the silver pen back across the table, letting it rest right next to the crystal wine glasses. I looked at the property deed one last time before resting my hands quietly in my lap. I told him I would sign before the dessert course was served. Garrett smirked at his colleagues and turned away, his attention instantly shifting back to Courtney and the executive sitting to his right. The psychological pressure cooker he had built was entirely designed to trap me, but he had no idea he was the one locked inside the cage. Deep inside my coat pocket, my cell phone suddenly buzzed with a sharp, heavy vibration. I slowly reached down and pulled the device into my lap, hiding the bright, illuminated screen beneath the edge of the heavy burgundy tablecloth. I unlocked the screen and opened the single secure text message waiting in my inbox. It was a short message from Mr. Harrison. "The federal authorities have been completely briefed on the embezzlement. We strike. The evidence is secured. Keep them at the table and await my final signal. Everything is moving into position. The war was finally over and I had won everything without them ever knowing." I kept the phone hidden beneath the tablecloth and looked around the dining room without moving my head. Nothing in the room appeared different. The candles still burned steadily inside their crystal holders. Silverware still rested in perfect alignment beside imported china. The turkey remained at the center of the table beneath a polished serving dome. Yet the message on my screen had transformed every familiar detail into part of a controlled operation. Garrett believed the evening belonged to him. He rose from his chair and lifted his champagne glass, asking the room for silence. His voice carried the effortless confidence of a man accustomed to being applauded before he had earned anything. He thanked Beverly for hosting such an elegant Thanksgiving dinner and praised the executives for taking time away from their families to celebrate what he called an important new chapter for Montgomery Defense Solutions. Beverly watched him with glowing pride. Courtney leaned toward him as if she already knew what he was about to announce. Richard and the other executives offered polite smiles, but I noticed that several of them exchanged guarded looks. Corporate people understood that unexpected speeches usually contained an agenda. Garrett announced that the board would soon consider him for promotion to Vice President of Strategic Operations. The title was not official, but he presented it as inevitable. He spoke about his leadership, his ability to manage sensitive budgets, and his record of building profitable vendor relationships. Every claim was delivered with absolute certainty. The room applauded, I did not. Garrett looked towards me, clearly expecting a public display of admiration. When I remained seated, he smiled tightly and told the guests that my recent surgery had left me exhausted. Beverly immediately added that I had also been experiencing confusion and emotional instability. Her voice sounded sympathetic, but the message was deliberate. Before I had said a word, they were preparing the room to distrust anything I might say. I lowered my eyes and allowed them to believe the performance was working. Beverly stood and walked to the sideboard. She returned carrying a decorative leather portfolio containing the property transfer documents. With theatrical care, she placed it beside my plate. She told everyone that Garrett had arranged a beautiful family safeguard for me. According to her, placing my house into a trust managed by her would remove unnecessary pressure from my fragile condition. A few guests nodded, others looked down at their plates. I opened the portfolio and slowly turned through the pages. I already knew what they contained, but I wanted the executives to witness the pressure. The trust granted Beverly complete authority to sell, refinance, lease, or borrow against the property. My name remained on the debt while control of the asset shifted to Garrett's family. It was not protection. It was a legal extraction. I asked Garrett whether his attorney had explained every clause to him. He smiled and said he had personally reviewed the entire structure. I asked whether he understood that Beverly would be permitted to borrow against the house. His smile tightened, but he confirmed that she would. I asked whether the trust could sell the property without my separate approval. Beverly interrupted, saying technical questions were exactly why I needed experienced people to manage the asset. Garrett placed a calming hand on her shoulder and told her not to worry. Then he looked directly at me and stated that he understood every provision and accepted full responsibility for the documents. Richard's eyes shifted toward him. I carefully closed this portfolio. Garrett had just admitted in front of multiple senior executives that he knew the trust would strip me of control. The admission was not central to the federal case, but it revealed his judgment, his intentions, and his willingness to exploit an injured spouse. More importantly, it showed the room that this was not a misunderstanding drafted by an overzealous lawyer. The first dessert course arrived. Servers placed small pumpkin tarts in front of each guest, but almost no one touched them. The tension around the table had become visible. Garrett tried to restore the celebratory mood by turning the conversation back to his promotion. Richard asked which new vendor relationships Garrett considered his greatest achievement. Garrett relaxed immediately. Numbers and status were his favorite subjects. He described several logistics consultants that had supposedly improved procurement speed. I recognized the names from the red-stamped investigation file. They were shell companies. I asked whether he had personally approved those consultants. He looked at me with open irritation. He said senior leaders did not need their wives interrupting technical discussions they could not understand. I apologized softly and asked the question again. Several executives stopped eating. Garrett gave a short laugh and said that of course he had approved them. He boasted that no major strategic vendor entered his division without his authorization. He added that his electronic credentials appeared on every important transaction because he was one of the few people capable of managing complicated financial arrangements without supervision. Across the table, Richard's expression became unreadable. Courtney reached for Garrett's arm and told him not to waste energy explaining corporate matters to someone who moved boxes for the army. The diamond bracelet slid down her wrist and caught the candlelight. She noticed me looking at it and deliberately rotated her hand so the stones were fully visible. Beverly laughed. I smiled at Courtney and asked whether the bracelet had been a recent gift. Her confidence flickered. She said it was personal and none of my concern. Garrett immediately claimed he had purchased it with a private performance bonus. That answer created another subtle shift around the table. Senior executives knew when bonuses were issued, and apparently no one remembered a recent payment large enough to explain the jewelry. Richard asked Garrett which quarter had produced the bonus. Garrett hesitated for less than a second, but I saw it. He named the previous quarter and quickly redirected the conversation toward an upcoming defense contract. Richard did not challenge him. He simply folded his napkin more carefully across his lap. The trap was tightening without my touching it. Beverly pushed the silver fountain pen closer to me. She announced that the documents should be signed before coffee so the family could end the evening with good news. Garrett leaned toward me and whispered that refusing now would make me look unstable in front of everyone. His tone was gentle enough for the room, but his fingers closed around my wrist beneath the edge of the table. The pressure landed directly beside my intravenous bruising. Pain shot up my arm. I looked down at his hand, then back at his face. He released me, but not before Richard noticed. I picked up the pen. The room became still. I uncapped it and turned to the final signature page. Garrett's breathing slowed with satisfaction. Beverly sat straighter. Courtney lifted her wine glass. They all believed the same thing, that fear, public pressure, and physical weakness had finally reduced me to obedience. I placed the tip of the pen above the line, but did not touch the paper. Then I asked Garrett one final question. I asked whether he was certain he wanted every person at the table to serve as a witness to the transfer. He laughed and said that public witnesses were exactly the point. He wanted there to be no question that I had signed willingly, understood the arrangement, and trusted him completely. I looked around the table. One by one, the executives met my eyes. Some appeared uncomfortable. Richard looked alert. None of them yet understood why the wording mattered. I asked the servers to leave the room and close the dining room doors. Beverly objected, but Richard quietly instructed the staff to do as I requested. The last server stepped into the hallway and the doors closed with a soft wooden click. The intimate family dinner became a sealed boardroom. Garrett tried to laugh it off. He told everyone that military officers loved unnecessary drama. I set the pen down beside the unsigned deed and rested both hands in my lap. Outside the tall windows, two dark vehicles turned slowly into the circular drive with their headlights off. They stopped beyond the line of winter hedges, nearly invisible from the dining room. A third vehicle remained at the street. My phone vibrated once beneath the tablecloth. I looked down. The new message contained only 7 words. All units are positioned. Harrison is at the door. I felt no rush of excitement, no panic, no desire to shout. What settled over me was the same cold focus I had relied upon during dangerous military movements, when timing mattered more than emotion, and one premature action could compromise an entire operation. I raised my eyes to Garrett. He was whispering something into Courtney's ear, already celebrating the house he believed he had stolen. I gave him one final moment to enjoy the illusion. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. The time for playing the meek, traumatized wife had officially expired. Beverly opened her mouth, likely preparing to launch into another suffocating speech about my fragile mental state and her son's infinite generosity, but I did not give her the chance. I reached down into my heavy leather tote bag resting beside my chair. My movements were slow, deliberate, and completely devoid of the trembling hesitation I had faked just moments before. I pulled out a thick stack of unredacted corporate expense reports, the ones Mr. Harrison and I had meticulously compiled and verified earlier that day. The pages were bound tightly in a black legal folder. I lifted the heavy folder and let it drop onto the exact center of the table. The loud, heavy thud of the thick document hitting the solid mahogany wood echoed like a gunshot through the dining room. Several crystal wine glasses rattled against the fine china. Conversation stopped instantly. Richard and the other executives stared at the black folder, their corporate instincts clearly sensing danger. Garrett blinked, his patronizing smirk faltering as he stared at the papers. He looked confused entirely, unable to comprehend how his helpless wife had suddenly produced a massive corporate ledger at his family dinner. I stood up from my chair. I did not rush. I smoothed the front of my dress and turned my attention directly to the young woman sitting completely frozen next to my husband. Courtney was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I kept my voice dangerously calm and incredibly clear, ensuring that every single person in the room could hear me perfectly. I pointed directly at the sparkling diamond tennis bracelet resting heavily on her left wrist. I asked her if she liked the bracelet. Courtney swallowed hard, instinctively covering the diamonds with her right hand. She looked frantically at Garrett, silently begging him to intervene, but he was staring at the black folder on the table as if it were a live grenade. I did not wait for her answer. I opened the front cover of the black folder and flipped directly to page 42. I read the detailed purchase order aloud to the silent room. I stated the exact date of purchase, the upscale jeweler located in downtown Chicago, and the staggering total cost of $24,000. Then I read the serial number associated with the piece, matching it flawlessly to the engraved serial number I knew was resting against her skin. I looked directly into Richard's eyes as I spoke. I explained that the $24,000 used to purchase that specific piece of jewelry had been billed to Montgomery Defense Solutions as a consulting fee for a dummy logistics corporation that did not actually exist. The room went completely rigid. Richard's face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He was a seasoned executive, and the casual mention of an enormous fraudulent consulting fee instantly registered in his mind. Courtney let out a small, pathetic gasp and physically pushed her chair back from the table, trying to put distance between herself and Garrett. The color drained from her perfectly contoured face. She was young and foolish, but she was not completely stupid. She knew immediately that she was wearing stolen corporate funds on her wrist, and she knew the federal implications of being caught with embezzled property. Beverly finally shattered the heavy silence. She slammed her hands down on the table, causing her silverware to clatter loudly against her plate. She stood up, her face turning a deep, furious shade of red. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me and began to scream at the top of her lungs. She yelled that I was completely ruining Thanksgiving with my pathetic, jealous delusions. She shrieked that my recent emergency surgery had clearly caused a severe mental breakdown, and that I was hallucinating insane corporate conspiracies just because I could not handle the pressure of being married to a successful man. She demanded that Garrett call the hospital immediately and have me committed to a psychiatric ward. She looked frantically at Richard and the other executives, desperately trying to construct a narrative of female hysteria to protect her precious son. She apologized loudly to the guests, claiming that my medication was making me dangerously erratic and completely detached from reality. She ordered me to leave her beautiful home this instant and stop trying to destroy her family with my vicious lies. I let her scream. I stood perfectly still and allowed her to exhaust her toxic, desperate energy. When she finally paused to take a breath, I raised my right hand and brought it down hard, flat against the solid wood of the table. The sharp, violent crack silenced her instantly. I did not raise my voice, but the tone I used was the exact command voice I had honed over years of directing military logistics units. It was a voice designed to cut through chaos and demand absolute obedience. The room froze. I looked Beverly dead in the eye and told her to sit down and shut her mouth. She dropped back into her chair as if she had been physically shoved, her jaw hanging open in sheer shock. I turned away from her completely and reached back into my tote bag. I pulled out 6 separate identical manila folders, each marked with a bright red confidential stamp. I methodically walked around the long dining table, handing one folder to Richard and distributing the rest to the other high-ranking corporate colleagues. I returned to my seat and explained exactly what they were holding. I detailed the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I explained the 4 long years of systematic siphoning. I walked them through the fake vendor invoices and the phantom service contracts. But I did not stop there. I made sure they understood the true depth of the malice sitting at the head of the table. I explained the frame job. I told them that Garrett had meticulously routed every single stolen dollar through accounts opened illegally under my name and my classified military identification credentials. I told the executives that their rising star had built an elaborate trap to ensure that when the federal audits finally caught up with his massive theft, his active-duty military wife would be the one going to federal prison in his place. Richard opened the manila folder and stared at the undeniable banking records, his expression turning to pure, unfiltered disgust. The other executives followed suit, the rustle of turning pages the only sound in the suffocating room. Garrett finally snapped out of his terrified paralysis. He sprang up from his chair, his face contorted into a feral, desperate snarl. He slammed his fists onto the table, leaning aggressively toward me. He screamed that I was a delusional nobody making up pathetic lies. He shouted that he was the future vice president of Montgomery Defense, a man of unassailable power. He pointed a shaking finger at my face, yelling that I could not possibly do this to him, that I was nothing without his protection. He demanded that I immediately take back every single word I had just spoken and beg his colleagues for their forgiveness before he ruined my entire life completely. Before he could take another step toward me, his attention snapped toward the darkened foyer. The heavy brass chime of the front doorbell echoed through the silent mansion, ringing twice before anyone processed the sound. Garrett froze, his finger pointing aggressively at my face, his chest heaving from the exertion of his frantic screaming. The executives exchanged nervous glances. They were sharks, and there was suddenly blood in the water. Beverly fluttered her hands in absolute bewilderment, looking toward the grand foyer as if expecting caterers. No one moved to answer the door. Instead, the unmistakable sound of a heavy key turning in the lock echoed down the marble hallway. I had given Mr. Harrison my spare key to Beverly's house earlier that morning, a calculated logistical maneuver, ensuring absolute surprise. The heavy oak front door swung open, and the measured sound of dress shoes clicking against imported Italian marble grew louder. The dining room watched in stunned fascination as a tall, distinguished man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit stepped into the arched doorway. It was Mr. Harrison. Flanking him were two massive, broad-shouldered men wearing dark suits and discreet earpieces, radiating the unmistakable aura of high-level corporate security. Mr. Harrison paused at the head of the dining table, his sharp eyes scanning the room behind silver-rimmed glasses. He carried a sleek black briefcase, calmly setting it on a side table near a vase of winter roses. The tension in the room ratcheted to an agonizing level. Richard and the other senior vice presidents immediately recognized the formidable attorney. Harrison was a legend in the corporate defense sector, a man whose presence usually signaled a devastating hostile takeover. Garrett lowered his trembling hand. The arrogant facade he desperately tried to maintain just moments earlier crumbled completely. He looked from the imposing security officers to the legendary attorney, his jaw opening and closing as he failed to form a coherent word. Beverly, completely oblivious to the sheer magnitude of the corporate power standing in her dining room, stood up and demanded to know how these men had gotten into her home. Mr. Harrison completely ignored her hysterical demands. He adjusted his glasses, his face devoid of any emotional expression, and turned his piercing gaze directly toward the high-ranking Montgomery Defense Solutions executives still seated around the table. He cleared his throat, his deep voice cutting through the suffocating tension. He formally introduced himself to the room, stating he was representing the newly formed majority shareholder coalition of Montgomery Defense Solutions. He explained with brutal surgical precision that while they were enjoying their holiday dinner, a massive financial maneuver had been executed. He informed the terrified room that an emergency proxy vote had been legally triggered, leveraging the blocks of stock quietly acquired through offshore holdings over the past 72 hours. He told them the current management structure was dissolved effective immediately. The company had undergone an absolute emergency change in ownership, and federal authorities had already received the complete unredacted ledgers regarding the massive internal embezzlement scheme. The blood drained so rapidly from Garrett's face that I thought he might actually collapse onto the expensive burgundy tablecloth. He staggered backward, his knees hitting the wooden dining chair behind him. He reached out blindly, his hand knocking over his crystal water goblet, sending a stream of cold water soaking into the expensive fabric. He knew exactly what this meant. The massive offshore accounts he had spent 4 years building, the accounts, safely hidden in the Cayman Islands under my stolen identity, had been legally seized and repurposed by the actual victim of his elaborate fraud. He had inadvertently handed me the exact financial weapon I needed to buy his entire company out from under him. The sheer poetic justice of his own stolen money funding his complete corporate destruction was an outcome he never anticipated. Courtney let out a sharp, terrified sob, practically climbing over her chair to distance herself from my husband. She looked frantically at the corporate security officers, her hands trembling so violently that the stolen diamond bracelet rattled against her wrist. Felicity sat completely frozen, her champagne glass forgotten in her hand, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror as she watched her brother's entire empire evaporate into thin air. Beverly sank back into her chair, her manicured hands clutching the edge of the table, her mind entirely unable to process the profound destruction happening in her pristine suburban mansion. The perfectly orchestrated holiday gathering she had designed to humiliate me had transformed into a public execution of her golden child. Mr. Harrison picked up a single crisp sheet of paper from his leather briefcase. He stepped forward, bypassing Garrett entirely, and stopped directly beside my chair. The dining room was so quiet, I could hear the frantic, shallow breathing of the executives sitting across from me. Richard wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, his eyes locked on the legal document. Mr. Harrison turned toward me, bowing his head slightly in a gesture of profound, absolute respect. He held out a silver pen, not the cheap one Garrett had tried to force upon me earlier, but a heavy, beautifully crafted instrument of real corporate power. He looked me directly in the eye, ignoring every other person in the room. "The hostile takeover is fully complete and legally binding," Mr. Harrison announced, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "Madam Chairwoman, your orders." The title hung in the heavy, silent air, a massive, devastating shockwave that completely obliterated everything my toxic in-laws thought they knew about me. Madam Chairwoman. The words hit Garrett like a physical blow to the stomach. He clutched the edge of the dining table, his knuckles turning stark white, his eyes bulging with absolute terrified comprehension. He looked at me, really looked at me, seeing not the vulnerable, traumatized military wife he had systematically gaslighted and abused, but the apex predator who had just swallowed his entire world whole. The pathetic illusion of his superiority was thoroughly shattered, leaving nothing but a desperate, cornered animal. I did not rush. I took my time. I slowly stood up from the table, smoothing the front of my dress with completely steady, perfectly calm hands. I looked down at the man who had spent 4 years trying to send me to federal prison, the man who had tried to steal my only home while I was recovering from emergency surgery, the man who had laughed while telling a doctor to let me die. I walked slowly around the edge of the table, the corporate security officers stepping back slightly to give me the floor. I stopped right in front of Garrett. He was trembling so violently his teeth were actually chattering. He tried to speak, tried to form some pathetic, desperate excuse, but his voice completely failed him. He was completely broken, stripped of every stolen asset, every lie, and every ounce of unearned pride. I leaned in close, invading his personal space just as he had done to me so many times before. I kept my voice low, icy, and entirely devoid of any mercy or hesitation. I made sure every single person in the room heard the absolute finality of my words. "You are absolutely fired," I whispered the command, dropping like a heavy guillotine blade. "And my lawyers have already frozen every bank account you have." He collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The security guards immediately stepped forward, pulling him to his feet and dragging him out of the mansion. The war was finally over. I had won. But the reality of his consequences was only just beginning to materialize. As the corporate security officers hauled Garrett through the arched doorway and into the grand marble foyer, a series of heavy knocks pounded against the thick oak front door. The sound was demanding, carrying the unmistakable weight of federal law enforcement. Mr. Harrison calmly stepped aside, gesturing for a security man to pull the double doors open. The chilly November night air rushed into the pristine foyer, carrying the frantic reflection of red and blue police lights. Law enforcement vehicles were parked haphazardly across Beverly's manicured lawn, tearing deep tracks into the expensive landscaping. 3 men and 1 woman stepped boldly across the threshold, their dark windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI. The lead agent, a tall woman with a stone-cold expression, held up her gold badge. The harsh light from the crystal chandelier caught the metal, flashing a blinding reflection into the dining room where the executives sat in stunned silence. The dessert plates meticulously prepared with pumpkin tarts sat forgotten on serving carts. The investigators had arrived exactly on schedule. Garrett stopped struggling. His custom-tailored shoes scraped uselessly against the polished marble floor as his legs gave out beneath him, his knees buckling under the terrifying weight of the moment. The lead federal agent did not waste a second on polite pleasantries. She looked down at the weeping man crumpled between the towering security officers and stated his full legal name with chilling authority. Her voice was intentionally loud, designed to carry perfectly into the formal dining room, ensuring his former colleagues heard every word. She formally announced his immediate federal arrest. She listed the severe charges with brutal clarity: corporate fraud, aggravated grand theft, federal wire fraud, embezzlement. Each charge hung in the quiet house like a heavy physical blow, cementing the inescapable reality of his destruction. Back in the dining room, the suffocating tension broke into desperate self-preserving action. Courtney let out a breathless gasp. She had been standing frozen near the table, but the terrifying sound of the felony charges snapped her violently into survival mode. She knew the investigators would trace the stolen corporate funds directly to the lavish gifts he had showered upon her. Watching with wide, terrified eyes as the agents pulled heavy steel handcuffs from their belts, she instantly made her choice. Courtney did not walk toward the man she had been sleeping with. She offered no defense or loyalty. Instead, she frantically clawed at her left wrist. Her manicured fingernails scratched ruthlessly against her own skin as she desperately fumbled with the complex safety clasp of the diamond tennis bracelet. Terrified that the federal agents would arrest her as an accessory, she finally forced the stubborn clasp open. She ripped the bracelet off her wrist as if the diamonds were burning her flesh. She dropped it unceremoniously onto the nearest dessert plate, letting the stolen jewels sink deeply into a soft, sweet mound of whipped cream. Without a backward glance, she grabbed her designer clutch and sprinted toward the rear of the house, escaping into the night through the discreet servant's entrance. Garrett watched her run away, realizing the woman he had destroyed his marriage for was entirely willing to leave him to rot in prison. At the far end of the table, Beverly was completely paralyzed. Her mouth opened and closed silently, unable to process the nightmarish reality unfolding in her home. She had spent decades curating an image of untouchable suburban wealth, and now federal agents were preparing to drag her golden child away. The corporate executives silently stood up in perfect unison. They did not say a comforting word to Beverly. They simply picked up the red-stamped folders containing the offshore banking evidence, buttoned their suit jackets, and walked out of the dining room. They filed past the federal agents with grim nods, actively distancing themselves from the radioactive wreckage of Garrett's ruined career. The federal agents moved forward in unison, pulling Garrett's arms roughly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed sharply through the grand foyer. The terrifying sound seemed to finally snap Garrett out of his catatonic shock. He twisted his upper body frantically, his face slick with cold sweat, and looked desperately back into the dining room. His terrified eyes locked directly onto me. I was still standing near the head of the table, my expression completely neutral, calmly watching his fraudulent empire burn to the ground. He began to pull against the grip of the agents, his voice cracking horribly as he shouted my name over and over again. He begged me to come out to the foyer. He pleaded with me, his voice pitching into a hysterical whine, to tell the federal investigators that this was all just a massive misunderstanding. His voice was shrill and entirely pathetic, completely stripped of the arrogant tone he had used to terrorize me for years. He cried openly, screaming that his spotless reputation would be completely ruined forever. He sobbed that he would lose his country club membership and his standing in the community. He actually dared to ask me to show him mercy, pleading with me to save him from the public humiliation of being paraded out to the police cruisers in full view of his wealthy neighbors. He promised frantically that he would give me the house, the money, and absolutely anything I wanted if I would just tell the agents to stop. I walked slowly and deliberately out of the grand dining room, the steady clicking of my heels echoing softly against the cold, polished marble floor. The federal agents paused their forward momentum, clearly instructed beforehand by Mr. Harrison to allow me a final moment. I stopped just a few feet away from my trembling, handcuffed husband. He looked up at me, his face streaked with pathetic tears, his custom-tailored suit deeply wrinkled. He was entirely broken, a hollow shell of the cruel monster who had systematically tried to steal my life. I looked down at him, searching my heart for even a fraction of sympathy, and felt absolutely nothing. The fear and the heavy weight of his psychological abuse had completely vanished, leaving behind only a cold, impenetrable resolve. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my voice incredibly calm and perfectly steady. I wanted the federal agents to hear me. I wanted Mr. Harrison to hear my final verdict. Most importantly, I wanted Beverly to hear me from her paralyzed seat in the ruined dining room. "I told them not to call me unless you're dead," I replied simply. Garrett flinched violently, physically recoiling as if I had just struck him across the face. The last desperate shred of hope completely vanished from his wide eyes, instantly replaced by pure, suffocating terror. He finally realized that the bridge between us had been completely vaporized. I stood up straight and gave a brief, polite nod to the lead federal agent. The woman nodded back, her expression grim, but deeply respectful, and firmly grasped Garrett by the arm. She hauled him forward without an ounce of gentleness, pushing him out through the heavy oak double doors into the freezing night air. The sweeping reflection of the flashing police lights illuminated his violently weeping face as he was marched forcefully down the front steps, entirely exposed to the staring, judging eyes of the affluent suburban neighborhood he had prized so dearly. Behind me, a terrible, gut-wrenching wail shattered the remaining silence. Beverly finally broke completely. She slid clumsily out of her expensive dining chair, her knees hitting the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. She collapsed entirely, her manicured hands tearing frantically at the immaculate burgundy tablecloth above her. She dissolved into loud, breathless, uncontrollable hysterics, mourning the complete, absolute, and highly public destruction of the son she honestly thought was invincible. The flashing police lights faded into the cold November night, taking the shattered remains of my abusive marriage with them. Beverly remained crumpled on the floor, her wails echoing off the pristine walls she prized above all else. Felicity sat frozen, staring at the empty space where her brother had stood. The immediate aftermath of Garrett's spectacular downfall was a whirlwind of federal agents securing the premises and seizing hard drives. I walked out of the mansion that evening with my head held high, stepping into a waiting car arranged by Mr. Harrison. The suffocating weight I had carried was finally gone, replaced by absolute pure freedom. But the federal investigation into Garrett's massive embezzlement scheme was only just beginning, and the authorities were exceptionally thorough. They did not just stop at the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands or the fake vendor invoices used to purchase Courtney's diamond bracelets. They traced every single stolen dollar back to its final destination. Over the following weeks, the true depth of the family's financial depravity was completely dragged into the unforgiving light of day. It was revealed through meticulous forensic accounting that my husband had not been acting entirely alone in his reckless spending. Beverly and Felicity had happily co-signed on several massive fraudulent loans using Garrett's inflated stolen corporate income as their primary guarantee. They had actively leveraged his illegal wealth to fund their own lavish, untouchable lifestyles. The extensive remodeling of Beverly's beloved suburban mansion, the imported Italian marble in the foyer, the custom landscaping, and the expensive country club memberships had all been heavily subsidized by Montgomery Defense Solutions. Felicity's boutique business, which she constantly bragged about at family gatherings, was entirely propped up by a series of shell company grants Garrett had illegally authorized. They had spent years looking down on my military salary and mocking my thriftiness, completely oblivious to the fact that their entire opulent existence was a fragile house of cards built on stolen corporate money. When the federal government seized Garrett's assets and froze his bank accounts, the shockwave obliterated his enablers instantly. The massive monthly payments required to maintain their luxury loans bounced. The banks, alerted to the federal wire fraud charges, immediately called in the debts. Beverly and Felicity were confronted with the terrifying reality of complete financial ruin. With Garrett's income entirely gone and their own assets legally tied to his fraudulent loans, they had absolutely no way to pay the mounting legal restitution required to keep themselves out of federal prison. The bank moved swiftly, initiating foreclosure proceedings on the pristine suburban mansion Beverly loved more than anything else in the world. She was forced to sell the sprawling property at a massive loss just to cover her immediate legal liabilities and avoid being charged as an active accessory to wire fraud. The public humiliation was absolute and devastating. The wealthy neighbors who had watched Garrett being hauled away in handcuffs now watched moving trucks clear out Beverly's custom furniture. She was unceremoniously stripped of her country club membership and completely shunned by the affluent social circle she had spent decades cultivating. With her bank accounts drained by aggressive defense attorneys and federal fines, Beverly had no choice but to move into a cramped, destitute apartment complex on the industrial side of the city. Felicity, her fake boutique business entirely bankrupt, was forced to move into the tiny second bedroom. The luxurious, entitled life they had viciously guarded and used as a weapon to make me feel worthless evaporated into thin air, leaving them with nothing but mounting debts and the suffocating reality of their own incredible hubris. Desperation breeds a very specific kind of delusion. 3 weeks after the mansion was sold, Beverly and Felicity attempted one final pathetic maneuver. I was sitting in my spacious, bright office on the top floor of the Montgomery Defense Solutions headquarters, reviewing the quarterly logistics reports with Richard. My new role as chairwoman of the board felt natural, utilizing the exact strategic management skills I had honed during my military career. The sleek phone on my mahogany desk chimed softly. It was the head of corporate security stationed in the main lobby 50 floors below. He informed me with a highly professional tone that 2 frantic women claiming to be family members were currently demanding to see me. He noted that they were causing a significant disturbance near the reception desk, loudly crying and begging the staff for a financial bailout. I stood up and walked over to the massive window looking out over the sprawling city skyline. I pictured Beverly and Felicity standing in the polished marble lobby, stripped of their designer clothes and their arrogant smirks, finally realizing that the woman they had relentlessly abused now held the absolute power to save them or let them sink. They had come to the company they helped defraud, begging the victim of their cruelty for financial salvation. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I pressed the intercom button and spoke with calm, icy precision. I instructed the security director that under absolutely no circumstances were those women permitted past the front desk. I told him not to let them up the elevator. I ordered security to escort them off the corporate premises immediately and to call the local police if they resisted or returned. I ended the call and picked up my personal cell phone. With a few quick, deliberate taps, I permanently blocked both of their phone numbers, severing their final desperate lifeline. But I did not stop there. I contacted Mr. Harrison and instructed his legal team to file the paperwork we had prepared earlier that week. By the time Beverly and Felicity returned to their miserable, cramped apartment, they were greeted by a process server. He handed them a thick stack of legal documents containing an ironclad restraining order. The comprehensive legal injunction permanently barred them from coming within 500 feet of my home, my corporate office, or my person ever again. The absolute severance was officially complete. They were entirely cut out of my life, left to rot in the squalor they had built for themselves. The final piece of business was handled with quiet, efficient dignity later that afternoon. Mr. Harrison arrived at my office carrying a sleek leather folder. He sat across from me and placed the documents on my desk. They were the finalized divorce papers. I picked up my favorite heavy silver pen, the one that felt right in my hand, and turned to the signature page. I read the stipulations carefully, ensuring every single clause was perfectly in place. The documents legally and permanently stripped Garrett of any possible claim to my active duty military pension. They completely shielded my new corporate assets, the Montgomery Defense shares, and my home from his greedy grasp. He was entitled to absolutely nothing. I signed my name on the dotted line with a smooth, unbroken stroke, officially dissolving the nightmare that had nearly cost me my life. Garrett signed his portion of the final documents from a cold, sterile room inside a federal holding facility. His expensive lawyers had abandoned him the exact moment his fraudulent funds were seized. Stripped of his money, his arrogant pride, and his powerful corporate title, he was forced to rely on an overworked public defender. Courtney was long gone, having secured immunity by fully cooperating with the prosecution and handing over every piece of stolen jewelry. His mother and sister were drowning in their own ruined lives, entirely unable to offer him comfort or financial aid. Without any leverage or resources, Garrett had no choice but to accept a brutal plea deal. He was sentenced to a mandatory 5 years in a federal penitentiary. The man who had callously told a hospital that I should be left to die was now entirely alone, facing half a decade behind bars without a single person in the world waiting for his return. Exactly 1 year later, the suffocating chill of that November night felt like a lifetime away. I sat at the head of the gleaming mahogany table inside the primary boardroom of Montgomery Defense Solutions. The morning sun streamed through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, bathing the entire room in warm golden light. I smoothed the front of my tailored navy suit, taking a slow, steady breath of the crisp air. My honorable discharge from active-duty military service had been finalized 6 months ago. The transition from military logistics commander to corporate chairwoman had been incredibly demanding, but profoundly fulfilling. The faces looking back at me around the long table were entirely different from the arrogant executives who had dined at Beverly's mansion. In my first 90 days as chairwoman, I had executed a ruthless, comprehensive purge of the entire corporate leadership structure. Every single vice president and senior manager who had enabled Garrett's massive embezzlement scheme was systematically investigated, terminated, and handed over to federal authorities. I refused to allow a single trace of his toxic, corrupt legacy to remain within the walls of this company. Richard and his accomplices were currently facing their own federal indictments for complicity. I replaced them with individuals who possessed impeccable integrity and proven track records of ethical leadership. Many of my new senior executives were brilliant minds I had served with during my military deployments. They were men and women who understood the absolute value of loyalty, transparency, and hard work. The corporate culture at Montgomery Defense Solutions radically transformed virtually overnight. The atmosphere shifted from a cutthroat environment of backstabbing and illegal self-enrichment to a space of genuine collaboration and mutual respect. The toxic shadows my ex-husband had cast over this company were completely permanently eradicated by the light of accountability. Under my direct supervision, the company did not just recover from the massive financial damage Garrett had inflicted, it absolutely thrived. I applied the exact logistical precision I had utilized to move military supplies across hostile territories to our corporate supply chain. We eliminated massive amounts of wasteful spending and streamlined our entire production process. Within 2 quarters, our profit margins reached record-breaking highs and our stock value skyrocketed. The market responded incredibly well to the dramatic change in leadership, recognizing that the new administration operated with absolute transparency and unmatched efficiency. We were securing massive government contracts entirely on merit. But maximizing corporate profits was never my ultimate goal. I had survived a nightmare that almost cost me my life, my freedom, and my sanity. I knew exactly what it felt like to be trapped in a web of domestic financial abuse, orchestrated by a ruthless narcissist. I knew the absolute terror of realizing the person you trusted most in the world was actively trying to destroy you. That profound, agonizing experience fundamentally shifted my perspective on what true corporate responsibility should look like. I realized that my newly acquired wealth and immense power carried a profound moral obligation. During the third quarter board meeting, I formally proposed the establishment of a massive, well-funded philanthropic arm within the company. I called it the Montgomery Phoenix Foundation. I diverted a significant percentage of our annual corporate profits to fully fund the initiative, ensuring it had the massive financial backing required to make an immediate impact. The foundation was specifically, uniquely dedicated to supporting wounded military veterans and active duty spouses who were facing severe domestic financial abuse. I presented the comprehensive proposal to my newly appointed board of directors, and they unanimously approved the initiative without a single moment of hesitation. We assembled an elite team of top-tier financial advisors, aggressive defense attorneys, and trauma counselors. Their sole mission was to identify and rescue military spouses who were trapped in the exact same nightmare I had endured. We provided them with immediate emergency funding, secure housing, and absolute legal protection. We assigned forensic accountants to untangle stolen assets and aggressive lawyers to freeze abusive partners' bank accounts. We gave victims the impenetrable shield they desperately needed to escape their abusers and rebuild their shattered lives. It was not just charity, it was a highly organized tactical rescue operation for the vulnerable. The Foundation's impact was immediate and staggering. Within the first 6 months of operation, we successfully extracted over 200 military spouses from dangerous, abusive marriages. We helped wounded veterans recover stolen military pensions and secured safe environments for their children. Every time I signed an authorization form to fund another rescue operation, I felt a profound sense of healing. Garrett had tried to use my military service and my physical vulnerability as a weapon to destroy me. Now I was using the very company he had stolen from me to save hundreds of others who shared my exact background. I concluded the morning board meeting with a thorough review of the Foundation's latest success metrics. The executives around the table nodded with genuine pride as we discussed the lives we had actively saved. I adjourned the meeting and thanked my team for their exceptional dedication. As they filed out of the room conversing happily among themselves, I remained seated at the head of the table. I savored the quiet, peaceful moment, letting the absolute reality of my current life wash over me. The stark contrast between my past vulnerability and my present authority was almost difficult to fully comprehend. I stood up from the heavy leather chair and walked out of the boardroom, making my way down the pristine, quiet hallway toward my private corner office. The administrative staff greeted me with warm, genuine smiles as I passed their desks. There was no fear in their eyes, no nervous tension, just simple professional respect. I entered my massive office and gently closed the heavy oak door behind me. The room was perfectly silent, offering a sanctuary of absolute calm high above the bustling, chaotic city streets below. I walked slowly across the plush carpet toward the massive windows. I stood before the towering expanse of glass and looked out over the sprawling, magnificent city skyline. The towering skyscrapers gleamed in the bright morning sunlight, projecting an aura of immense strength and enduring permanence. I placed my hands on the cool, smooth glass and took a deep, steadying breath. I thought about the terrified, broken woman I had been a year ago lying in a hospital bed, wondering if I would survive my husband's cruel neglect. I thought about the sheer terror of discovering the massive offshore accounts and the elaborate, sinister trap he had set for me. I realized in that quiet, sunlit moment that my initial desire for retribution had completely evaporated. The spectacular public downfall of my ex-husband and his toxic family had certainly delivered a profound sense of necessary justice. But the deep, lasting satisfaction did not come from their destruction. It came from my own creation. I had learned through the darkest, most agonizing fire that true, authentic power is never about seeking vicious revenge. Revenge is a chaotic, desperate emotion that ultimately ties you to the people who hurt you. It keeps you chained to the past and the trauma. True, absolute power is about something entirely different. It is about taking the broken, shattered pieces of your life and methodically building an impenetrable fortress of success that your abusers can never, ever touch. It is about transforming your deepest pain into an unstoppable force for good. I had finally successfully built that specific, magnificent fortress. I had surrounded myself with loyal, brilliant allies and created a legacy that would protect the vulnerable for generations to come. I was no longer a victim waiting for a rescue that would never arrive. I was the chairwoman. I was the empowered, confident rescuer. I smiled warmly, looking at the bright, endless, majestic horizon stretching out before me. The nightmare was finally completely over, and my beautiful new life was only just beginning. What makes Jillian's experience especially disturbing is that the danger did not begin with the hospital recording or the missing money. The warning signs had been present for years. Garrett mocked the work that gave her independence, treated shared finances as his private property, used his family to reinforce his version of reality, and described every act of resistance as instability. His betrayal became criminal, but the system of control had been built gradually through humiliation, secrecy, and financial dependence. Her escape began when she stopped debating his intentions and started preserving facts. She saved the recording, reported the transfer, secured her income, documented the timeline, and placed evidence in the hands of people with the authority to act. That distinction matters. When someone is committed to manipulating the truth, another emotional argument rarely creates accountability. Clear records, independent advice, protected finances, and trusted witnesses often carry far more power. The anonymous gift changed Gillian's circumstances, but it was not the source of her discipline. Long before she became chairwoman, she already possessed the skills that ultimately saved her patience under pressure: attention to detail, the courage to ask for help, and the ability to act before fear made the decision for her. Her story also leaves an important question. How many people remain trapped because the abuse does not look dramatic from the outside? Financial control, identity theft, isolation, medical neglect, and repeated attacks on a person's judgment can be devastating even when no visible injury exists. Recognizing those patterns early can protect a home, a career, and sometimes a life. Jillian's victory was not simply that Garrett was punished. It was that his choices no longer defined what happened next. She recovered control of her name, her work, her property, and her future, then used that freedom to create protection for others. Have you ever had to silently build your own fortress to escape a toxic environment, or shocked those who underestimated you with your undeniable success? Share your journey of reclaiming your independence in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe for more empowering stories of survival and sweet justice.